Nobody expected the Cleveland Browns quarterback competition to become one of the biggest stories in football this early. Not in May, not during organized team activities, and certainly not after months of reports suggesting the path forward was already taking shape. The conversation all offseason seemed straightforward. Deshaun Watson was healthy, a new coaching staff was in place, and offensive coordinator Todd Monken was expected to build a system that could finally unlock the version of Watson the Browns thought they were getting when they made one of the most expensive quarterback investments in NFL history. The assumption wasn't that Watson would have to fight for the job, the assumption was that the job was already his. Then something happened that nobody inside or outside the organization could completely ignore. On the first major practice sessions of the offseason, a young quarterback who many people had already written off as a long-term project suddenly became the center of attention. Shedeur Sanders arrived carrying expectations that were dramatically different from the ones he had in college. Gone were the headlines about being a star prospect. Gone were the debates about where he should have been drafted. Gone were the cameras that followed him everywhere during his time at Colorado. In Cleveland, he entered a quarterback room where experience, money, and organizational pressure all seemed stacked against him. And yet, within a matter of hours, the conversation started changing. Reports coming out of practice described a quarterback playing with confidence, precision, and a level of composure that immediately caught people's attention. It wasn't just that passes were being completed. It wasn't just that plays were being made. It was the way they were happening, the timing, the decision-making, the command. The type of moments that make coaches stop talking, make teammates start paying attention, and make observers wonder whether they may have underestimated someone all along. What makes this story even more fascinating is that it comes after one of the most debated draft slides in recent NFL memory. When Shedeur Sanders fell far lower than many expected, countless opinions flooded social media. Some believed teams had made a massive mistake. Others argued the league knew something the public didn't. For over a year, those debates never really disappeared. They simply waited for an opportunity to be tested on an NFL field. Now, that opportunity has arrived. No one is handing Shedeur Sanders a starting job. No one inside the Browns organization has declared a winner. Training camp hasn't started, mandatory minicamp still looms ahead, and the quarterback battle remains far from decided. But something important happened the moment those first reports started spreading across the football world. For the first time since arriving in Cleveland, Shedeur Sanders forced people to stop talking about what he might become someday and start talking about what he is doing right now. And what happened next has some Browns fans wondering whether this competition was ever as one-sided as everyone believed. If you rewind the clock just a few weeks, the idea of Shedeur Sanders seriously disrupting Cleveland's quarterback hierarchy would have sounded unrealistic to many people around the league. The narrative felt settled long before the first OTA practice ever began. Deshaun Watson wasn't simply viewed as another quarterback competing for a roster spot. He was viewed as the centerpiece of the Browns' plan. Whether fans agreed with it or not, the organization had invested years, resources, and enormous expectations into seeing Watson succeed. From the outside looking in, the path seemed obvious. Watson would reclaim the starting role, the offense would be tailored around his strengths, and everyone else in the quarterback room would be fighting for backup positioning. That perception didn't come out of nowhere. Watson carried advantages that few quarterbacks entering a competition could match. He had years of NFL experience. He had faced elite defenses. He had navigated playoff pressure. He understood the speed of professional football in ways younger players simply couldn't. When coaches install a new offense, veteran quarterbacks often receive the benefit of experience because they've seen similar concepts before. They understand defensive disguises, they recognize tendencies, they know how to adjust protections and make checks at the line. Those are advantages that don't show up in highlight videos, but can determine who wins a job. Then there was the financial reality hanging over everything. Whether people wanted to discuss it publicly or not, large contracts inevitably create expectations.
Organizations don't make major investments hoping those players sit on the bench. They want those investments to pay off. They want validation. They want proof that the plan was correct all along. For months, analysts repeatedly pointed to that reality when discussing Cleveland's quarterback situation. Many believed Deshaun Watson would be given every opportunity imaginable to secure the role, because that's simply how professional football often works.
Meanwhile, Shedeur Sanders entered the building carrying a completely different set of expectations. His draft journey had already created skepticism. After one of the most heavily discussed draft slides in recent memory, many observers viewed him as a developmental player rather than an immediate threat. Some analysts questioned whether he would even be part of meaningful quarterback conversations during his early NFL years. Others believed he would need significant time before challenging established veterans. The discussions surrounding Sanders rarely focused on winning a starting job anytime soon. Instead, they centered around patience, long-term development, and future potential. That's what made the situation so fascinating, because while public conversations focused almost entirely on Watson, Sanders quietly entered an environment where expectations were remarkably low. And sometimes, that's exactly where dangerous competitors thrive. There's a certain freedom that comes from being overlooked, a freedom that allows players to focus solely on performance instead of protecting reputations. Sanders wasn't expected to save the franchise. He wasn't expected to carry the offense. He wasn't expected to become the headline of the offseason. In fact, many people barely expected him to be part of the story at all. The quarterback competition had essentially been framed as a discussion about Watson's comeback rather than Sanders' opportunity. Every projection, every draft chart prediction, and nearly every offseason breakdown seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. The veteran would lead, the younger quarterbacks would learn. End of discussion. But football has a funny way of ignoring predictions. The moment players step onto the field, contracts stop throwing passes, draft positions stop reading defenses, narratives stop completing third-down conversions. Suddenly, the only thing that matters is performance. Coaches watch, teammates watch, evaluators watch, and every snap becomes an opportunity to challenge assumptions that may have existed for months. That is exactly what was waiting for Shedeur Sanders when the offseason practices began. And before the first week was even finished, some of those assumptions were already starting to crack. But the most surprising part wasn't that Sanders played well, it was how quickly people around the team began noticing it. The first thing people noticed wasn't a spectacular touchdown, it wasn't a viral highlight, it wasn't some dramatic moment that immediately exploded across social media. What caught attention was something much harder to fake and much more valuable to coaches: consistency. From the opening portions of practice, reports suggested Shedeur Sanders looked unusually comfortable for a young quarterback operating in a new system. That's important because OTAs can be brutal for quarterbacks who are still trying to learn terminology, timing, and responsibilities. Even talented players often hesitate during their first offseason under a new coaching staff. There's a split-second delay as they process information. Routes develop before they're fully ready. Reads come a fraction of a second too late. The game suddenly feels faster than expected. That didn't appear to be happening with Sanders. Observers repeatedly pointed out how decisive he looked. The ball was coming out on time. He wasn't holding on to passes longer than necessary. He wasn't constantly second-guessing himself. Most importantly, he appeared to be operating with confidence rather than caution. For a quarterback trying to climb a depth chart, that matters tremendously. Coaches can teach mechanics, they can improve footwork, they can refine decision-making, but confidence under pressure is much harder to develop. Either a quarterback trusts what he sees or he doesn't. And during those early sessions, Sanders looked like someone who trusted exactly what he was seeing. As practice continued, the numbers being discussed around the facility began drawing attention. Reports suggested Sanders was completing passes at an extremely high rate during various team periods and 7-on-7 drills. While off-season practice statistics should always be viewed carefully, the efficiency itself became impossible to ignore. Completion after completion started creating a pattern.
What initially seemed like a few good reps was turning into an entire practice full of successful plays. That's when the real buzz started growing. Because veteran quarterbacks are expected to complete passes during off-season workouts, they're expected to look comfortable, they're expected to command the offense. A younger quarterback generating that kind of attention so early is what causes people to start asking questions. Not because it automatically means he's ready to start, but because it forces evaluators to take a closer look. Suddenly, conversations that had previously centered around Watson began including Sanders more frequently. Reporters covering practice weren't just mentioning him in passing, they were discussing specific throws, specific decisions, specific moments where he stood out among a crowded field of professional athletes. That's a very different level of attention than simply being another quarterback getting reps. What made the situation even more interesting was the way Sanders seemed to handle the environment itself.
Remember, this wasn't a college practice. This wasn't a controlled setting where everyone already knew him as the star attraction. These were NFL veterans, established professionals, players fighting for contracts, roster spots, and careers. Respect isn't handed out in those environments, it's earned. And one of the fastest ways to earn it is by making plays when everyone is watching. By all accounts, Sanders wasn't shrinking under that pressure. Instead, he appeared energized by it. Every successful rep seemed to build momentum. Every accurate throw created more confidence. Every completed pass gave observers another reason to pay attention. What started as a routine OTA session was slowly turning into something far more significant. The young quarterback many had labeled a developmental project was beginning to look like someone determined to accelerate that timeline. And perhaps the most surprising part was that the excitement wasn't being driven by hype alone. There were actual plays behind it, real moments that forced people to stop discussing potential and start discussing performance. Moments that made evaluators glance at one another, moments that made teammates react, moments that hinted this might be more than just a good practice. Because as impressive as the overall efficiency was, there were a few specific throws that reportedly changed the tone of the entire conversation. And one of them left people wondering how a quarterback in that position could have possibly completed the pass at all. Every quarterback can complete routine passes during off-season workouts. That's not what changes opinions inside an NFL building. Coaches expect short completions, they expect checkdowns, they expect quarterbacks to look comfortable when the defense isn't allowed to fully unleash pressure. The throws that people remember are the ones that aren't supposed to happen, the throws that make everyone watching pause for a second and wonder if they actually saw what they think they just saw. According to reports coming out of practice, Shedeur Sanders delivered one of those moments. It happened during a sequence that initially looked completely ordinary. The defense had done its job, the pocket picture had become messy, the timing of the play appeared disrupted. For most quarterbacks, especially younger ones, this is where survival instincts take over. Protect the football, throw it away, live to see the next snap. Coaches generally won't criticize a quarterback for making the safe decision when a play starts breaking apart. But Sanders didn't choose the safe decision. As the play developed, reports indicated his body position was far from ideal. His weight wasn't balanced, his feet weren't perfectly set. The type of mechanics quarterback coaches spend years trying to eliminate were suddenly part of the equation. Everything about the situation suggested the play was heading toward an incomplete pass or a throwaway. Yet Sanders never stopped looking downfield. That's the detail that stood out to many observers. Young quarterbacks often panic the moment structure disappears. They see pressure and immediately focus on escape routes instead of opportunities. Sanders reportedly did the opposite. Even as the play deteriorated around him, his eyes remained downfield, searching for a window that most players might have already abandoned. Then came the throw. With defenders closing space and his body working against him, Sanders reportedly delivered a pass toward KC Conception that somehow arrived exactly where it needed to be. Not late, not floating, not lucky,
The ball reportedly traveled with enough accuracy and velocity to allow the receiver to continue naturally through the route. What made the play remarkable wasn't just the completion itself, it was the combination of difficulty and confidence required to attempt it in the first place. Think about that for a moment. A quarterback entering one of the most important competitions of his career had every reason to play conservatively, every reason to avoid mistakes, every reason to protect his standing. Instead, he trusted his arm, trusted his vision, and trusted the opportunity unfolding in front of him. That's not something coaches can teach overnight. That's instinct. And it's often the difference between quarterbacks who simply operate offenses and quarterbacks who create plays when everything breaks down. What reportedly happened next may have been even more telling than the throw itself, the reactions. Football people tend to be careful with praise. Scouts don't usually celebrate during practice. Coaches don't typically overreact to one rep in May. Veteran players have seen too much football to get excited over every good play. Yet several accounts from observers suggested this particular moment generated immediate attention, the type of attention that spreads quickly through a practice field without anyone needing to say much at all. Because sometimes the loudest reactions are the silent ones. A glance between evaluators, a coach stopping mid-conversation, a teammate turning his head just a little longer than usual. Those small reactions often reveal more than public statements ever could.
The reason this throw became such a talking point wasn't because it automatically proved Sanders should be the starter. It wasn't because one pass wins a quarterback competition. Everyone understands that. The significance was what the play revealed. It showcased arm talent, confidence, creativity, composure under pressure, the ability to keep a play alive mentally, even when it appears dead physically. Those are traits NFL teams spend years searching for, and suddenly, people who had entered the offseason expecting Sanders to be a long-term project were being forced to reconsider what they were watching. But as impressive as that throw was, some around the Browns reportedly came away even more impressed by something else entirely. Because the next sequence didn't showcase physical talent, it showcased something that may matter even more. The funny thing about quarterback evaluations is that fans and coaches often look at completely different things. Fans remember the deep bombs, the impossible completions, and the highlights that dominate social media. Coaches notice something else entirely. They notice what happens before the throw. They notice the decisions. They notice how quickly information is processed. They notice whether a quarterback understands what a defense is trying to do before the ball ever leaves his hand. That's why some of the most talented throwers in football history never became elite quarterbacks, while others with less spectacular arms built incredible careers. The difference is usually found between the ears. And according to many observations coming out of Cleveland's offseason sessions, that may be one of the areas where Shedeur Sanders is creating the strongest impression. One of the most discussed moments from practice reportedly came during a red zone situation, where the offense initially appeared headed toward trouble. The play design seemed straightforward. The defense recognized it quickly. Passing lanes began disappearing almost immediately after the snap. For most young quarterbacks, this is where hesitation becomes deadly. One extra second of uncertainty is often enough for a scoring opportunity to vanish. But hesitation wasn't what observers reportedly saw. Instead, Sanders appeared to process the situation almost instantly. As defenders adjusted and the original read became less attractive, he reportedly shifted his focus without panic. There was no frantic scrambling, no desperate reaction, no sense that the moment was moving too fast. Rather than forcing the football into traffic or settling for the safest possible option, he reportedly identified another opportunity developing elsewhere on the field. That may sound simple. It's not. What separates NFL quarterbacks from college stars is often their ability to recognize changing situations in real time. Defensive coordinators at this level are paid millions of dollars to create confusion. Coverages rotate after the snap. Blitzes appear from unexpected angles. Passing windows open and close in fractions of a second.
The quarterbacks who survive are the ones who can process all of that information faster than everyone else on the field. That's why coaches obsess over decision-making. A quarterback with elite arm strength can make exciting throws. A quarterback with elite processing can control entire games. Reports from practice suggested Sanders wasn't just relying on natural talent. He appeared to be understanding where the football needed to go and when it needed to get there. Those are two very different skills. Plenty of quarterbacks know where they want to throw. The great ones know exactly when the opportunity exists and refuse to miss it. The red zone sequence reportedly highlighted that distinction. As the defense adjusted, Sanders reportedly manipulated the situation with subtle movements and disciplined eyes. Instead of locking on to one target and hoping the play worked anyway, he appeared willing to move through the progression and trust what the defense was showing him. That level of patience is unusual for younger quarterbacks, especially ones competing for attention. Many players trying to make an impression force difficult throws because they feel pressure to create highlights. Sanders reportedly did the opposite. He allowed the play to come to him. That's a trait coaches love because it translates beyond practice. Athletic ability can be neutralized by elite defenses. Arm talent can be challenged by weather, pressure, and physical limitations. Mental processing travels everywhere. It works in practice, it works in preseason, it works on third down in front of 70,000 fans when the entire stadium knows the game is on the line. And the more observers watched Sanders operate, the more that aspect of his game reportedly started generating discussion. Not because he was perfect, not because he had already won anything, but because the flashes being displayed weren't random. They weren't lucky completions or broken play miracles. They were signs of a quarterback understanding how to navigate professional football. Signs that the game may not be moving too fast for him. Signs that he could be further along than many people originally believed. That's where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for those who dismissed him after the draft, because arm talent has always been part of the discussion surrounding Shedeur Sanders. Confidence has never been difficult to find. The real question was whether he could process the game at an NFL level when surrounded by faster athletes, more complex defenses, and significantly higher expectations.
Early reports suggest he may be answering that question much sooner than expected. And that leads directly to the storyline that has followed him ever since draft night, a storyline that many people believed would define his career for years to come. There are certain moments in sports that age differently over time. On the day they happen, they seem logical, reasonable, maybe even inevitable. But months later, after new information emerges and performances begin stacking up, people start looking back and asking a very uncomfortable question. What if everyone got it wrong? That's the question quietly beginning to follow Shedeur Sanders again. Because before there was a quarterback competition in Cleveland, before there were impressive OTA reports, before there were conversations about processing speed and NFL readiness, there was draft night. And for Sanders, draft night became one of the most talked about stories of the entire year. For months leading up to the draft, opinions on Sanders varied dramatically. Some evaluators viewed him as one of the more polished quarterbacks in his class. Others questioned aspects of his game and projected a longer developmental timeline. Debate is normal in the NFL. It happens every year. What wasn't normal was how far the conversation ultimately swung once the draft actually arrived. Round after round passed, then another and another. Teams that needed quarterback help went in different directions. Organizations that appeared to be possible landing spots chose other players. The waiting continued far longer than many analysts had predicted, and with every passing selection, the story grew bigger. Suddenly, the discussion wasn't just about football anymore. People began creating explanations. Some believed teams had uncovered concerns that weren't obvious to the public. Others argued that Sanders had become a victim of groupthink, where organizations collectively convinced themselves to move in another direction. There were countless theories, countless debates, countless arguments across television shows, podcasts, and social media platforms. But no matter which side people supported, one fact remained the same.
A player who many expected to hear his name called much earlier was still sitting there waiting. For most athletes, that kind of experience leaves scars. It creates frustration. Sometimes it creates doubt. Sometimes players spend years trying to recover confidence after being publicly passed over by organization after organization. What makes Sanders' story interesting is that he appears to have approached it differently. Instead of fighting the narrative publicly, he simply kept working. Instead of spending months responding to criticism, he focused on preparing for the next opportunity. That's often easier said than done. Every athlete claims they use criticism as motivation. Far fewer actually transform disappointment into productive growth. The challenge isn't hearing the doubters. The challenge is staying focused when the doubters seem to be winning the argument. And for a while, many people believed they were. After all, the NFL is supposed to be the ultimate evaluator of talent. When multiple organizations pass on a player, the assumption is that those decisions must be based on information the public doesn't possess. That's why draft position often follows players throughout their careers. First-round picks are constantly given opportunities because of where they were selected. Late-round picks are constantly asked to prove why everyone else was wrong. Sanders entered the league carrying that exact burden. Every practice became a test. Every preseason snap became evidence. Every success created new questions. And now, those OTA performances are causing some observers to revisit assumptions that once felt settled. Not because one strong practice automatically proves the draft process failed. It doesn't. One off-season session isn't enough to rewrite history. It's not enough to declare that dozens of NFL decision-makers made a mistake. That's not how professional football works. Careers are measured over years, not practice periods. Evaluations are tested over seasons, not practice periods. But what a performance like this does accomplish is something equally important. It reopens the conversation. It forces people to take another look. It reminds everyone that draft position and future success are not always connected. NFL history is filled with examples of overlooked players becoming stars. Tom Brady wasn't supposed to become Tom Brady. Brock Purdy wasn't expected to transform a franchise. Countless productive quarterbacks entered the league carrying labels they eventually shattered. And now, some Browns fans are beginning to wonder if Sanders could be attempting something similar. What's especially fascinating is that the pressure surrounding his situation may actually be creating an advantage. Every strong performance strengthens his case. Every successful practice increases attention. Every positive report creates another opportunity to challenge perceptions that followed him into the league. And the more attention Sanders receives, the more another reality becomes impossible to ignore. Because while everyone is focusing on his rise, there's another side to this story that keeps getting more complicated. A side involving a veteran quarterback, massive expectations, and a situation that becomes more difficult with every impressive rep Sanders put on tape. The most uncomfortable part of this entire story has very little to do with Shedeur Sanders himself. It has to do with what happens if he keeps playing well.
Because as exciting as Sanders' emergence may be for Browns fans, every strong performance creates a more complicated situation for the organization. Not because anyone is rooting against him, not because coaches don't want competition, but because the quarterback room in Cleveland wasn't originally built around a rookie sensation suddenly forcing his way into the conversation. It was built around Deshaun Watson, and that's where things become difficult. To be fair, Watson still possesses advantages that cannot simply be dismissed after a few successful OTA sessions. He has years of NFL experience. He's played in meaningful games. He's faced playoff-caliber defenses. He's operated under the pressure that comes with being the face of a franchise. Those experiences matter. Coaches value them. Organizations value them. There is a reason veteran quarterbacks often receive the benefit of the doubt when competitions become close. Experience isn't something that can be replicated in practice. Neither is the ability to navigate an entire NFL season. That's why many people around the league remain cautious when discussing the Browns' quarterback battle.
OTA highlights can be exciting, but they don't always predict what happens when training camp arrives. They don't always predict what happens when pass rushers can fully attack. They don't always predict what happens when game plans become more sophisticated and mistakes carry greater consequences. Watson knows that, the coaching staff knows that, and Sanders almost certainly knows it too. But here's the challenge nobody can completely avoid. Quarterback competitions have a way of creating momentum. Once people begin noticing a player, every performance receives additional attention. Every successful throw becomes part of a larger conversation. Every practice creates new comparisons. Suddenly, the discussion isn't just about whether Sanders is playing well. The discussion becomes whether he's playing enough to force difficult decisions. That's a very different conversation. Because if Sanders continues stacking productive practices, the coaching staff faces an increasingly fascinating evaluation process. They must determine whether they're seeing a young quarterback experiencing a strong off-season stretch or a young quarterback accelerating much faster than expected. Those are two very different possibilities, and identifying the difference is one of the hardest jobs in professional football. Meanwhile, Watson enters every practice carrying expectations that few players in the league understand. When veterans perform well, people often shrug and say that's what should happen. When younger players perform well, people become excited because there's an element of surprise attached to it. That's why quarterback competitions can sometimes feel unfair. The established player is expected to succeed. The challenger gets rewarded for exceeding expectations. And right now, Sanders appears to be exceeding expectations. That doesn't mean Watson is losing. It doesn't mean he's been overtaken. It doesn't mean the starting job is suddenly changing hands. But it does mean something important. The gap people assumed existed between the two quarterbacks may not be as wide as originally believed. That's what makes this storyline so compelling. For months, much of the football world viewed the Browns' quarterback room through a very simple lens. Watson was the established answer. Everyone else was competing for future opportunities. That framework was easy to understand. It was comfortable. It made sense. Now things feel considerably less certain. Because uncertainty is what happens when a young quarterback starts making people ask questions they weren't expecting to ask. Questions like how quickly is he developing? Questions like how much weight should be placed on these performances? Questions like what happens if the momentum continues through minicamp and training camp? Those aren't questions anyone expected to dominate discussions this early in the offseason. Yet here we are. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that the most important phase of this entire competition hasn't even started yet. The practices generating headlines right now are only the opening chapter. The real test is still waiting, and what happens over the next several weeks could determine whether this becomes one of the biggest stories of the NFL offseason or simply an interesting moment that briefly captured everyone's attention. The dangerous thing about momentum in the NFL is that it can disappear just as quickly as it arrives. That's why the next phase of this story is so important. Right now, Shedeur Sanders is generating excitement because of what he's shown during off-season practices. The throws have been impressive, the reports have been encouraging, the confidence appears real. But everyone inside the Browns organization understands a truth that football fans sometimes forget. No quarterback wins a starting job in May. The real battles begin when the stakes start increasing, and that's exactly what's coming next. Over the next several weeks, every practice becomes more important than the last, every rep carries more weight, every mistake becomes more noticeable. What initially feels like a promising storyline eventually evolves into a serious evaluation process. Coaches stop looking for flashes and start looking for consistency. They stop asking whether a player can make great throws and start asking whether they can repeatedly make the right decisions.
That's the challenge waiting for Sanders. The first wave of attention is usually the easiest part. Maintaining it is much harder. NFL coaches have seen countless players dominate small stretches of off-season work. They've seen quarterbacks light up practice fields, only to struggle when the environment becomes more demanding. That's why organizations are careful not to overreact. Talent can create excitement. Consistency creates trust. And trust is ultimately what wins starting jobs. The next major checkpoint comes when competition becomes more structured and more intense. Defensive schemes become increasingly complex. Coaches intentionally create difficult situations. Quarterbacks are asked to prove they can handle adversity, rather than simply perform when things are going smoothly. It's one thing to complete passes when momentum is on your side. It's another thing entirely to respond after a bad series, a turnover, or a difficult day of practice. Those moments reveal who a quarterback really is. That is where Sanders faces his biggest opportunity, because if he continues performing at a high level as the evaluation process becomes tougher, the conversation surrounding him changes dramatically. He stops being viewed as a young player generating off-season buzz and starts being viewed as a legitimate factor in the future of the franchise. That's a significant difference. One attracts headlines, the other forces organizational decisions. And that possibility is exactly why so many people are paying attention. What's fascinating is that Sanders doesn't necessarily need to be perfect to keep building momentum. In fact, perfection isn't what coaches are looking for. They're looking for growth. They're looking for adaptability. They're looking for evidence that the positive traits appearing during OTA sessions remain visible when circumstances become more difficult. Can he process information just as quickly when defenses disguise coverages more effectively? Can he maintain confidence after mistakes? Can he command a huddle filled with veterans when pressure begins mounting? Can he continue making smart decisions when every throw is being analyzed? Those are the questions that truly matter. And unlike off-season narratives, those questions can only be answered on the field. At the same time, Watson isn't standing still. That's another reality that often gets overlooked during breakout stories. Veteran quarterbacks don't stop competing because younger players generate attention. If anything, competition tends to elevate everyone involved. Watson still has an opportunity to remind people why he was once considered one of the most dangerous quarterbacks in football. He still has opportunities to establish himself as the clear leader of the room. He still has opportunities to make this competition look exactly the way many expected it would from the beginning. Which means the most interesting part of this story may still be ahead. Because the closer Cleveland gets to training camp, the harder it becomes to ignore direct comparisons. Every throw will be compared. Every practice report will be analyzed. Every positive development will fuel debate. And as that pressure increases, the true nature of the quarterback battle will finally begin revealing itself. For Shedeur Sanders, that's both exciting and dangerous. Exciting because opportunities like this don't come often. Dangerous because expectations are now rising. People are watching more closely. The spotlight is getting brighter. The margin for error is shrinking. And yet, if the early reports are any indication, Sanders may welcome that challenge rather than fear it. Because the biggest reason Browns fans can't stop talking about him right now isn't a single throw or a single practice. It's the possibility that this story could become something much bigger than anyone originally imagined. A possibility that touches the deepest question Cleveland has been asking for decades. At the heart of this entire story is a question that Cleveland Browns fans have been asking for longer than some NFL players have been alive. Have they finally found their franchise quarterback? It's a question that has haunted this organization for decades. Coaches have come and gone, general managers have changed, draft picks have arrived with enormous expectations and left with disappointing results. Every few years, hope would appear, a new quarterback would arrive, the excitement would build, the conversations would begin, and eventually, reality would set in. That's why Browns fans are different when it comes to quarterbacks. They've learned to be careful. They've learned not to fall in love with headlines. They've learned that one great game doesn't guarantee a great career, and one exciting offseason doesn't guarantee long-term success. The scars of the past have taught them patience, but they've also taught them something else.
When something feels different, they notice. And that's why the Shedeur Sanders story has captured so much attention so quickly. Not because he has already won the starting job, not because the quarterback competition is over, not because anyone inside the organization has declared him the future of the franchise. None of those things have happened. What has happened is much simpler. A young quarterback who many people doubted has walked into an NFL building and started forcing people to reconsider their assumptions. He's made throws that generated attention. He's shown confidence in situations where many expected caution. He's demonstrated traits that coaches value far beyond arm strength. And perhaps most importantly, he's given Browns fans a reason to pay close attention to every practice, every report, and every development moving forward. That's a powerful thing, because hope is one of the most valuable currencies in professional sports. For years, Cleveland fans have been searching for signs that the endless quarterback carousel might finally be slowing down. They've been searching for evidence that the next answer could be closer than anyone realizes. They've been waiting for a player capable of changing the conversation from what went wrong in the past to what might be possible in the future. Whether Shedeur Sanders becomes that player remains unknown. The road ahead is still incredibly long. Mandatory minicamp will bring new challenges. Training camp will bring tougher evaluations. Preseason games will bring entirely different levels of pressure. Every quarterback in the room will have opportunities to strengthen or weaken their case. Nothing has been decided. But that's exactly what makes this moment so fascinating. For the first time in a long time, the most important question in Cleveland doesn't seem to have an obvious answer. The competition feels real, the outcome feels uncertain, and the possibility feels bigger with every passing week. Maybe Watson ultimately reminds everyone why experience matters and secures the role without question. Maybe Sanders continues building momentum and turns one surprising offseason performance into something much larger. Or maybe this quarterback battle takes twists that nobody can predict today. That's the beauty of football. The answers aren't found in predictions, they're found on the field. And right now, the field is telling the story that very few people expected to hear. A story about a quarterback who entered the offseason with almost no expectations and suddenly became one of the most talked about players in the entire organization. A story about a draft slide that may not define a career after all. A story about opportunity, pressure, and proving people wrong. Most importantly, a story that has reopened a question Cleveland has spent nearly 27 decades trying to answer. Is Shedeur Sanders simply the latest quarterback to generate excitement? Or is he the player who finally changes everything? The next few months may provide the answer. And if the early signs are any indication, the entire football world is about to be watching.